This is the Evo SP8 by Audient, and this is an 8-channel smart preamp with AD and DA. And yes, it does look almost exactly like the Evo 16, but these are very different devices. The Evo 16 is an audio interface, while the SP8 is a preamp that will add 8 more inputs and outputs to your audio interface. So if your audio interface only has, let's say, 4 inputs and outputs, but you need to record a full band or a choir or something, then you can add the SP8 to your setup, and then you'll have a total of 12 inputs and outputs in this case. Of course, if you add the SP8 to your Evo 16, then you'll have 16 analog inputs and outputs. And what sets the SP8 apart from other external preamps is the SP8 is a smart preamp. So if you're familiar with the Evo 16, or even the Evo 8 or Evo 4, then you know these interfaces have Smartgain. And Smartgain will set your input gain for you in about 20 seconds. And it works the same exact way on the SP8. So we have 8 channels of Smartgain on the SP8. You can set them individually or set all 8 at the same time. But it gets even cooler when you use the SP8 with the Evo 16. When you connect these two units together, it creates an expanded Evo system. And that means you can adjust the gain of the inputs on the SP8 directly in the Evo app. You can turn on or off phantom power, select instrument level, all the things that we can do with the inputs directly on the Evo 16. We can also drop into Smartgain from a single interface. So when I press the Smartgain button, both units drop into Smartgain. You can select the individual channels on each unit, or select all 16 channels at the same time and have your input gain set for you automatically across all 16 microphones in about 20 seconds. And if that's still not enough for you, then hold on. You can also add a second SP8 to your system. That's right, 2 of them. And you can set the input gain across all 24 channels in about 20 seconds. So that can be a huge time saver if you're recording something like a live band with individual mics on everything, a choir with individual mics for everyone, an orchestra, a large podcast, even something like a late night style show where you have individual mics for guests plus a live band. You can set the gain for all of those mics in about 20 seconds. So the SP8 integrates seamlessly with the Evo 16. And if you already know how to use the Evo 16, then you will instantly know how to use the SP8 since operation is practically identical across both units. Now, if you don't know how to use the Evo 16, no problem. You can always go watch the full Evo 16 video, which I'll put in the description below. But you can also use the SP8 with other audio interfaces. So if you happen to really like the audio interface you already own, no problem. You can easily add an SP8 to your system, of course, assuming that your interface has ADAT, and you can expand your system with 8 more inputs and outputs, plus use Smartgain across the 8 inputs on the SP8. You can also use the SP8 as a standalone preamp. So for example, if you want to plug a mic into input 1, you can turn on phantom power, use Smartgain, and then have that go out of output 1 into a live speaker, a standalone recorder, an effects unit, a mixer, whatever. You can do all of that as well. So whether it's for recording use or live use, the SP8 can handle it. All right, so now we'll get the SP8 connected to our audio interface, see how to set it up, go over all of the features, and get up and running. First, we'll start with the unboxing, and feel free to pause if you want to read this. Let's pop it open. Here's your quick start guide. We'll check that out real quick. And of course, you can always grab the full manual from the website. There's your power cable and the unit. All right, so that is everything that is in the box. You'll also get access to some plugins and software whenever you register the SP8. Design-wise, the SP8 is almost exactly the same as the Evo 16. It has the same all-metal chassis. It feels very sturdy. On the front, you have the multi-control wheel and the Motion UI screen. You can turn the knob. You can press in on the knob. You can press and hold the knob to get to your settings. You have your channel select buttons, phantom power, instrument level button, and the Smartgain button. There are two mic line instrument inputs on the front, so you can use XLR cables for microphones, quarter-inch TRS cables for line-level devices, or quarter-inch TS cables, also called instrument cables, for things like guitar or bass. Of course, just switch channels 1 or 2 over to instrument level. On the rear, there are 6 mic or line level inputs. There are 8 line level analog outputs, and you can choose what's going out of these from your settings page. Then you have your ADAT inputs and outputs, a Wordclock input. There is a USB-C port here, but it's only for updating the firmware, so there's no need to connect this to your computer. And the power cable plugs in here on the rear. On the bottom, there are 4 rubber feet to help keep the unit in place if you're putting it on your desktop. And you'll also find the serial number and pin here on the bottom. You also have the option to mount the SP8 in a rack, but for that you will need to purchase the rack kit separately. Once you get it, you'll first remove the rubber feet from the bottom of the SP8, then remove the 4 screws from each side. We'll connect the rack ears to the SP8 and then mount it in your rack. Keep in mind, rack screws are not included with the rack ear kit, so you'll have to have your own rack screws. If you don't have any, I'll have links in the description below. Now I'll connect the SP8 to our audio interface. I'm going to use the Evo 16 for now, but the steps will be the same for any audio interface. First, grab your Toast-Link cables, also called optical cables or light pipe cables, and connection is pretty intuitive. Inputs go to outputs, and outputs go to inputs. Pretty simple, right? So we'll take output 1 of the interface to input 1 of the SP8, and then output 1 of the SP8 to input 1 of the audio interface. Now, if your audio interface only has an ADAT input, then you'll run a single optical cable from the output of the SP8 to the input of your interface. And also be aware that if your interface doesn't have an ADAT output, or you simply don't connect the ADAT output, then obviously you won't be able to send digital audio from, say, your DAW into the SP8. But of course, you'll be able to use the 8 inputs. You'll see what I mean when we look at our output options. All right, so we have our SP8 connected to the Evo 16, and 2 cables is all you really need as long as you're staying between 44.1 and 48K. Now, if you're going to record at 88.2 or 96K, then you'll need to connect 2 more cables the exact same way. Outputs to inputs, right? You also have the option to use Wordclock. Now, we don't technically need it here since we're just using a single SP8, but you would definitely want to use it if you were trying to sync 2 SP8s. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use Wordclock with a single SP8. I'm just pointing out that you don't have to, all right? And many audio interfaces don't even have Wordclock, so you can use the digital ADAT clock, no problem. We'll connect it both ways here, but we're going to start with the digital ADAT clock. So once you have your optical cables connected, we need to sync the units with a master clock and match the sample rate. For the Evo 16, I can do this from the system panel, and this will be similar for whatever audio interface you are using. Make sure your digital inputs and outputs are set to ADAT, and the default clock is set to internal. Now that's because our audio interface will be the master clock, and the SP8 will sync to that clock. So in general, you'll have one device, usually your audio interface, set to internal, and the other device set to external, or in this case, it's going to be called digital. What you don't want to do is set your audio interface to internal and set the SP8 as internal, because then you'll have 2 clocks and you're going to end up with a bunch of pops and clicks. So once again, the Evo 16 is set to internal. Then come to the SP8, press and hold the wheel, clock source, and choose digital. Okay. Then come to sample rate, and we need to match this to the Evo 16. The Evo 16 is set to 48K, so we can choose 48K on the SP8. Okay. However, if we come back to sample rate, down here at the bottom, you'll see we also have an auto option. So that means if I change the sample rate of my audio interface, it will automatically update on the SP8. So that's a really cool feature to have, especially if you're always changing sample rates, right? So I'll just choose auto. All right, and that's it. You're all set up and ready to record. Now, if you want to use Wordclock, and it's generally suggested that you do, but you don't have to, grab your 75 ohm BNC cable, connect it, everything for our audio interface will be exactly the same, so there's no need to change anything here. On the SP8, we'll come to clock source and choose Wordclock. Then scroll down to Wordclock and make sure termination is on. And that's because this is the final device in our chain. If you were using two SP8s, the first one would be set to off, and the second one would be set to on. After that, we'll check our sample rate, and we're still set to auto, so we're all good here. Come down to status, and as you can see, we are now synced to Wordclock. All right, so once again, we are ready to record. Recording with the SP8 is pretty straightforward. If I have a condenser microphone plugged into input 3, I'll select input 3 on the front, turn on phantom power for that channel. I can set the input gain manually by turning the wheel, and we have a 58 dB gain range, just like the Evo 16. So that's -8 to +50. And that's enough gain for most microphones. However, if you are using some broadcast dynamic microphones like the SM7B, then you'll also want to have a cloud lifter around. That's the mic I'm using right now, by the way, an SM7B with a Coda Stealth, which is just like a cloud lifter, all right? And we're running to the SP8, by the way. This entire narration is with the SP8. We'll look at Smartgain here in a minute, but for now I'll just set the gain manually. Since we're using the SP8 with the Evo 16 to create that expanded Evo system, I can also set the gain from the Evo app. Do things like turn on or off phantom power. Here's where you set your monitoring levels. You can see the input level on the screen of the SP8. In your DAW, set the input to ADAT 3 in this case. And there you go, you're ready to record. If you're recording a guitar, plug it into inputs 1 or 2. I'll just use 1. Select the channel, switch it to instrument level, turn up the gain, select ADAT 1 in your DAW, and that's it. You're ready to record guitar. So what is Smartgain? Well, Smartgain will set your input gain for you and in about 20 seconds. So for example, I have 3 microphones plugged in right now into inputs 3, 6, and 8. I'll press the Smartgain button, select channels 3, 6, and 8. Press the Smartgain button again, then start talking into the microphones or having the band play or playing an instrument, whatever. And the input gain will be set automatically across all 3 microphones in this case, or it could be 1 microphone or even all 8 microphones at the same time. So imagine being able to set the input gain for an entire drum set in about 20 seconds. But it gets even cooler than that. If you're using the SP8 with the Evo 16, then you can use Smartgain across all 16 channels at the same time, or even across 24 channels if you're using 2 SP8s. To do that, press the Smartgain button on either unit. It doesn't matter which one. Pressing a Smartgain button will drop both units into Smartgain. From there, you can manually select individual channels across both the SP8 and the Evo 16. But in this case, I want to select all 16 channels. And there's a shortcut for that. Instead of just pressing the Smartgain button, I'll press and hold the Smartgain button until the input channels stop blinking. Okay, release the button. All 16 channels are selected. Press the Smartgain button again, and the input gain will be set across all 16 inputs in about 20 seconds. Now that's pretty cool, and it's a huge time saver when you're working on large projects. Also, the preamps of the SP8 and the Evo 16 are the same. So you're going to have the same sonic profile across both units if that happens to be important to you. Of course, you can use the SP8 with other audio interfaces like I do. I normally use the ID44 Mark II as my main audio interface, and the SP8 gives me a different color of preamp, So now I have options to use different preamps for different sources. Plus, it gives me Smartgain, 8 more input channels, and 8 more output channels, which is important to me because the ID44 only has 4 analog outputs. And setting up the SP8 with another audio interface is exactly the same. I set the ID44 to internal, set the SP8 to digital or Wordclock if you're using that. Of course, match your sample rates or just leave it on auto. And that's it. You're good to go. The outputs of the SP8 can be used in 2 different ways. Come to Settings, Output Source, and we can select between digital or analog. If I choose analog and say I have a microphone plugged into input 4, then that signal will be sent out of output 4. Or if it's plugged into input 8, then the signal will be sent directly out of output 8. You can then run that signal into external processors, a speaker, a headphone amp, a mixer, whatever you want. And by the way, even when the outputs are set to analog, you can still record the ADAT inputs in your DAW. If we switch to digital, now we can send audio from our DAW through the outputs of the SP8. So for example, the ID44 only has 4 analog outputs, and I already have 2 pairs of studio monitors connected. But I also want to use a headphone amp, or it could be a 3rd set of speakers, or even a 4th set of speakers. It's really whatever you want. First, I'll make sure the digital outputs on the ID44 are set to DAW through, although you can get some interesting routing by using these other options. It just depends on what options your audio interface has, so feel free to play around with this. But we'll go with DAW through, so there's no attenuation. I'll set the outputs to digital on the SP8. Connect the headphone amp. We'll choose outputs 3 and 4. No specific reason, really could be any of them. Then in your DAW, create a headphone bus. Set the output to ADAT 3.4. Play back, and there we go. We're still feeding audio to our studio monitors through the ID44, plus we're feeding audio from our DAW into the SP8 and out to our headphone amp, or it could be a 3rd set of speakers or whatever you want. If you press in on the control wheel, we can see the input from our DAW on 3 and 4. I could also add another output, maybe for a 3rd set of speakers, on ADAT 7 and 8. You'll see that on the digital inputs. Then of course you'll actually have to plug something into outputs 7 and 8 to hear that audio. You could also send individual tracks out of a pair of outputs, maybe 5 and 6, for example. So think of your outputs like this. If set to analog, whatever number input you are using, the same signal will be routed to the corresponding output. 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3, etc., etc. If set to digital, then whatever ADAT outputs you choose in your DAW will be sent to those analog outputs. ADAT 3 and 4 goes to analog output 3 and 4. ADAT 7 and 8 goes to analog output 7 and 8. You get the idea. And by the way, if you're not seeing all of the inputs and outputs for the SP8 in your DAW, you may need to set that up in your DAW. So if you don't know how to do that, you'll have to reference the manual for whatever DAW you happen to be using. And finally, there are a few more features of the SP8. To turn it off, press and hold the knob, go to Power, and choose Yes. Or you can press and hold for about 4 seconds, and it will drop you into the Power Off page. To turn it on, press in on the control wheel. You can mute your input channels. Just press and hold on the input you want to mute. Now it's muted and the channel is blinking. Press and hold again to unmute. You can turn on phantom power per channel. So select the channel you want, press the 48V button, and then phantom power is only applied to the channel or channels you choose, and not to all channels. Of course, to turn it off, select the channel and press the 48V button again. You can switch inputs 1 and or 2 to instrument level by selecting the channel and pressing the instrument button that looks like a guitar. And if you happen to be using the SP8 with the Evo 16, you can also switch to instrument level in the Evo app. You can turn on or off phantom power and even adjust the input gain of the SP8 right in the Evo 16 on-screen mixer. You can also link your channels together by pressing them at the same time. You'll see the link icon on screen, and then when you set your input gain, it will be matched across both channels. So if you have a stereo setup, this is perfect for that. To unlink, press them at the same time again. And we've already seen this, but I'll cover it one more time. You can press in on the control wheel to flip between seeing your analog inputs and digital inputs, that's from your DAW. If you're already familiar with the Evo 16, then you'll instantly know how to use the SP8. Everything from muting channels, linking channels, phantom power, instrument level, smart gain, flipping through your inputs, and even accessing the settings, it's all the same between both units. So that is the Evo SP8 from Audient. It gives you 8 more inputs, and the preamps on this sound very crisp and clean, and they're also very natural. There's not a ton of color going on here. They're going to end up being, like I said, very transparent overall, with maybe a teeny tiny bit of that Evo character. It gives you 8 more outputs, smart gain, a ton of other features that make it very flexible, and it's also straightforward and easy to use. You can add it to your Evo 16, or even add a couple to your Evo 16 to create that expanded Evo system. Or if you're happy with the interface you're already using, no problem. But you need some more I/O and you want to add smart gain to your system, well, you can do that with the SP8 and continue using the audio interface that you already like. If you want to learn more about the SP8 or to pick one up for yourself, I'll be sure to have links in the description below. So that is the Audient Evo SP8.